Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of
Yep.
Bible Study with us.
Guess it's an episode.
This is, I think, 7, 8, something like that.
I think you're being very generous.
Am I?
I don't know.
I don't know. We'll see. I'll count later. Either way, thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
So we've had a busy week.
Yeah.
Working on the garden still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're still trying to get that thing under control.
Yep.
We talked to our neighbor, found out when we should plant. So
Yes.
we plan on planting maybe this weekend if it's not raining.
Yes.
So
Yes.
let us know if we're wrong.
Yeah. It froze.
We don't know what we're doing.
We had a freeze 2 days ago, 3 days ago, something like that. So it was good we didn't plant that.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And working on a drain in the backyard. So we'll see how that goes. That's all. That's all me and Aiden. And
Aiden's really just getting worms and then putting them in the garden.
Yes.
And so
yeah.
Super helpful to you.
He's been very helpful.
Yeah.
Picking up rocks. So
yeah.
He's been good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So it's been good week. Getting busier a little bit. I'm at work a little bit more, and so but getting busier.
Yeah.
And so we are going into 2 Thessalonians, and so we decided just to kind of finish out the Thessalonians. We're going to hit all 3 chapters today.
It's very short letters.
Yeah, it's very short. So it's kind of a recap a little bit too. It's almost like some of the things he's just emphasizing a little bit more, expanding a little bit in. And so to kind of get us back into mind of where we are in everything, we had 1 Thessalonians. He was in Corinth. He is still, our cat's up. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. He is still in Corinth, and they're not exactly sure when this one, when he wrote this one, but they said it was soon. You know, some commentaries said soon, some said 4 to 6 months. I kind of feel like they mean the same thing. But it was shortly after the first letter. We kind of get the feeling in this letter that the reason he wrote this was to clarify some things, but then also there have been some people lying about things in the Thessalonian church. And so there sounds like maybe somebody forged a letter with Paul's name on it and sent that off, and said some things in the letter that the end times has already come. Right. And so he's kind of addressing that. But there's been some false things going around. So he's trying to clarify things. Right. Again, still in Corinth, just shortly after, and writing to the Thessalonians.
So in chapter 1, just as Paul did in his first letter, he kind of starts out with just praising them. Again, continuing to praise them. They're still in suffering, and there's a lot of indications that the suffering has gotten worse, the persecution has gotten worse. Yeah. And so Paul is just continuing to, encourage them and praise them for their faithfulness in the persecution and in their suffering. And he kind of goes a step further. So, in the first one, he's focusing on how well they're doing, staying faithful.
Right. And saying that he's an example, they're examples and everything
throughout the region.
And yeah.
But it's gotten worse. And so he kind of goes one step further, and he starts to talk about the fact that God is a just God, and that God is looking out for them and watching out for them. And that in the end, even though they are in suffering now, and even though they're being persecuted at the hands of other people, that God will oversee justice for them. And so, and you can kind of get lost in this idea that God is going to take vengeance against them because of their treatment against, the Thessalonians. Right. But really what Paul is focusing on is not the vengeance side of God. What Paul is focusing on is telling the Thessalonians, take heart, because your God is looking out for you. He's holding you in the midst of this. And even though you're going through persecution now and suffering now, that in the end, these ungodly people who are persecuting them will kind of get what they're asking for. They're asking for separation from God, and in the end they will get that. And I think
so if they're choosing separation from God, in the end they're going to get what they choose. And so they're choosing separation from God. They're choosing to be evil in the sight of God, choosing to persecute the Thessalonians. And we're reading through, we're in Psalms and Samuel and stuff right now, and it's kind of cool just to see even David through the Psalms give this kind of same idea when he's pouring out his heart to God. asking for God to essentially, execute justice on these people that, and Saul that's persecuting him. And so it's just kind of cool to see that relation. Side note, we didn't plan that.
Yeah, but it is, because it just shows that there is this continuity throughout Scripture, that God is a just God, and that his followers need to simply lean into him and trust him, and let him take care of the enemies, or take care of the persecutors, and not feel this need to to take things into their own hands. But at the same time, again, the focus here is not on the justice of the persecutors.
No.
The focus is on, Thessalonians, take heart in your suffering, because your God holds you. And he even as he closes out that first chapter, it says, trust that God will fulfill every good purpose of yours and every act prompted by faith. And so he's again encouraging Thessalonians, continue to do what you've been doing. Continue to hold tightly to your faith. Continue to do righteous acts. Live out according to Christ's principles and the principles that Paul has taught them, and let God kind of weed things out in the end. Stay faithful to the word, and let God, take care of justice. And so, it's just kind of calling all of us in the midst of any suffering or persecution we may go through, to stay steady, to stay strong, to lean into Christ, to not get distracted by the winds and the waves, but to stay focused on God and let him be that guiding light.
And to remember that there's an end game, that, Christ will have victory in the end. And we may not see it in our lifetime, but, that there will be victory in the end. And so we can kind of rest in that. So going into chapter 2, it kind of talks in that end time, kind of clarifies a lot of the end time sequence and talks about that a little bit more. Paul addresses that letter that we he kind of says there's been a letter that went around that somebody signed off Paul's name on. And this letter, from what we get from this chapter, this letter made the Thessalonians feel that the end times had already come. And so they were kind of panicking, thinking they missed it, and panicking that, maybe, because Paul kind of talked about being ready before. And so they thought maybe we weren't ready enough. Maybe we missed it. And
that Jesus had come like a thief in the night, and they had missed it.
They had missed it. And so he kind of gives them a little bit of rest, that he says that it won't be, everybody will know. It'll be quite obvious. It'll be, there'll be the labor pains that come up. He starts to reference kind of Mark 13, where Jesus talks about end times, and that there'll be labor pains, and that, so he kind of, talks about how we've already talked about this, kind of referencing Mark 13, and also things that we don't hear in Scripture that he's probably talked to them about. And so kind of just talks about the Antichrist coming, and that when he comes to power, that, it'll be obvious. And that when Jesus comes, it'll be obvious. And so they can kind of rest that they won't miss it. And so it's kind of encouraging in that. But yeah. And so anything else on that?
No, I think it again, it's just that comfort in knowing that God is not a mystery that's unfolding in front of us. That, Jesus gave clarity on end times events. Paul is reiterating that. And he's comforting the Thessalonians and saying the events will be obvious. And so, rest in your, rest in the security of your salvation, and the security of your relationship with Jesus, that, Jesus isn't going to come and go and you're going to be left behind. That you're going to know, and you're going to be a part of that. And so just to be at peace, I guess.
Well, and even at that time, he said, there's a lot of things already in progress. You might be seeing some signs. And I feel like we're seeing that quite a bit lately. I mean, I think that that's pretty obvious that, wars and rumors of wars, and that we're, feeling the labor pains. And it's just interesting because, God's timing is not our timing. We really don't know if it'll be in our lifetime, or if it'll be in our children's lifetime. It just depends on how long that labor is. And if it's like me, it's fast, but other people not so lucky. And so you just don't know how long those labor pains will go. And so just being prepared, focusing that we are that God is coming, but then focusing on what's important,
right,
and that God will kind of keep that justice. But
right. Well, and Paul's focus here too is on the witness that the Thessalonians have, that it's always this constant building of your witness. And I think that that's really the message to us today, is no matter what we go through, no matter what's happening, no matter what we're facing or what situations are coming against us, that we must, like you said, there's an end game that we need to be focused. And it's not this temporal life that we live. It's not, the current situation we're going through. The focus is always the end game of spreading the good news of Christ, spreading his love, and bringing others into relationship with Jesus. And that's what he's saying to the Thessalonians is, you're going through persecution, you're going through suffering, and you're being praised throughout the nations for that, for your faithfulness. Stay faithful, because that witness, though it may seem like you're not having a great impact in droves of numbers, it's still building a witness, and people's lives are still being changed. And so that's the message to us too.
Well, and one thing we kind of talked about when we were going through this was just that one thing we have to remember as Christians is the story. We already kind of know the end. And so we already know that we are going to spiral to this, increasing chaos. And so this increasing evil, and then Christ will win in the end. But we already know that there's going to be an antichrist. We already know that there is going to be, again, increasing wars and rumors of wars. We already know that. And so rather than trying to always oppose that so strongly when it's kind of futile a little bit. And so it's just, instead of trying to oppose that so strongly and standing up on our soapbox opposing that, which I think we should oppose evil.
Right.
However, focusing on what our testimony as Christians is. And so just trying to pull people to Christ and focus on, how can we pull people toward Christ? How can we show them our love? How can we walk and be like Jesus? How can we kind of show that and, kind of so that people want to be around us, want to know more, want to know Jesus. And so that's kind of, trying to make sure that you focus on that. What is the focus?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because in the end, if end times events are unfolding, then it is the sovereign will of God that those unfold. And even though we should stand against evil, there's also a point where evil must play its part in the end times. And so if we stand against, the events of the end times, are we standing against the will of God? And I don't know the answer to that question, but it's something that we have to wrestle with.
Theoretical.
Just throwing it out there.
Yeah.
But again, the point is, what we can focus on and what we should focus on, and what Paul is pushing the Thessalonians to, is the witness. The witness that you have, the love that you share, the peace that you give. Those are the things that set us apart from the rest of the world.
Right. And then in 13 through 17, he again just kind of encourages them, talks again about sanctification, making sure that they're continually trying to sanctify themselves, but then also just really trying to build them up and encourage them and comfort them.
Right.
And so that kind of finishes out chapter 2.
So when we come into chapter 3, there's this little glimpse that we have into what's going on in Corinth. Paul asks for prayer for them and what's going on in Corinth, and that'll come into play more, when we get to the book of Corinth, to the Corinthian letters. But it's just interesting to see Paul kind of, even share. He's been instructing a lot and encouraging a lot, and now this is a little bit of a vulnerable moment for Paul to share with the Thessalonians. Like, we had this great time with you, and so many great things have happened and are continuing to happen since we've left. But here we are in Corinth, and it's a little bit more challenging, a little bit more difficult. And so, he gives some instructions on how they can pray for him. And then he goes into this encouragement of staying away from idleness, staying away from, this being diligent in work, being diligent in applying their hands. Uses himself as an example. Says, when I was with you, essentially he says, when I was with you, the rule was, if you don't work, you don't eat. And so, so Paul is kind of challenging them, and we talked about it. We're not quite sure there's a couple different theories as to why Paul is pushing this? Did they think that they'd missed Christ's return, and so they kind of just threw their hands up and said, okay, well,
what's the point of working?
Yeah, what are we going to do now?
Yeah.
Or were they maybe thinking that, the end times were near, and so it didn't matter if they worked anymore? And then there was even a theory that some of them were kind of working as servants to the Greek elite, and just kind of taking a little bit of a random payments.
Yeah, so the elite would just kind of do odd jobs, would hire them for odd jobs and have them do these odd jobs. Sometimes they were a little immoral. Some of these odd jobs they got caught up in the busyness. And so that's kind of why they thought that this might be, when they're talking about being busybodies, they kind of get caught up in the gossip of the area. And so that's kind of why one of the theories is that, so these people, they would take odd jobs, but they wouldn't work all the time. Right. It'd be like being paid a lot in short amounts.
Right.
And so it was just kind of different, but then they would get caught up in the busyness and the gossip of everything.
And again, this was hurting their witness. They weren't setting a good example for the unbelievers in the area, because they saw this kind of busybody behavior, or even this laziness behavior. And so, Paul is just encouraging them. He says, distance yourself from idleness and encourage your idle brothers to start working. And so he's saying, like, when I was with you, I didn't have to work. I could have lived off of everybody's generosity, but I chose to work to set an example to you on how this should be done. And you should follow suit, start working, start applying yourself, and be a testimony, to the rest of the community in your work. And so I think that's a good word for us.
Right. Well, I feel like everybody can see that when people tend to not have things that they have to do, and that work that requires them to focus their time on work, they get kind of into a lot of other things. And so, you can see that in office environments. You can see that in a lot of different settings. If you're slow, it tends to, you start kind of, talking about things and getting into, things that you should, getting in trouble. And so, so that's, I think, something that we could all take to heart.
Yeah. Now we understand that our current situation, a lot of us aren't working. So
right. Yeah.
I don't want anybody to feel convicted about that. Unless you should be working, then start working.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Was that all you were going to say?
That's all I was going to say about that. Yep.
Okay. And so we have already gone through chapters 1, 2, and 3. So what do we get from all this? What is the big arching picture from 2 Thessalonians? And again, he kind of goes into different things that he talked about in 1 Thessalonians. He kind of talks about, again, praising the Thessalonians. He talks about the end times, kind of how he talked about that. Talked about the idleness in 1 Thessalonians. He kind of just expands it all.
Yep.
And so what he really kind of is getting into is that God is just. And so, he will take care of us. God is just. We don't need to stand up for ourselves. God will work it out in the end. Our focus should be showing God's love and being a beacon of light to those around us. That should be our focus. That should be our focus. We want to be that city on a hill. We want to bring as many people as we can to him. And so that's kind of that overarching theme, because the end is coming. And so, he's just talking about that, because the end is coming. What should be our focus? We should be focusing on trying to bring people to Christ. And we should focus that God is just. He's got the rest under control.
Right.
Calm down. Lean into him. Yes. He's got it.
Yep. And I think that it's something that we always carry with us all the time, because, I like to be in control of things. I'm not a huge worrier, but I do like to plan for every possible contingency.
It's crazy.
And so it's challenging to just say, okay, God, you've got this, and I'm just going to take my hands off. And so, but I think that's what Paul is even saying in this. Like, you're being persecuted, you're going through suffering, and you're going to feel this need to take control, or you're going to feel this need to, to step into space that you're probably not supposed to be in. Let God fill that space.
Yeah.
Trust in him, trust in the process, trust in sovereignty, and let him have his way in the situation. And I think that, as the church, that's a challenging thing, because we're also called to go and be witnesses. We're called to go and influence people and be leaders and all those things. So there's a fine line between influence and leadership to our communities and to the rest of the world.
Right.
and stepping aside and letting God move and have his way.
And don't you feel like the key part in that is like being in relationship with God so that we can know when he's telling us to go, to stand up, to fight for those, and when he's telling us to like back down.
Yeah. And I think it's challenging, especially in our American culture, because we go, go, go.
Yeah.
And sometimes the best thing we can do is stop and see what the next step God is taking is.
Yeah.
And asking God, okay, I don't know where you're going. And so I'm going to wait right here until you take the next step or you tell me what my next step is. And yeah, it's incredibly hard, again, because our culture is so go, go, go and busy, busy, busy and move, move, move. And a lot of times God is just saying, just hold on, because my timing isn't played out yet, because circumstances aren't what they should be, whatever the case is. And I think that, you know, that's a discipline that we have to continue to build in ourselves, of waiting on the presence of God, being patient, being in relationship, hearing his voice, tuning it in, and ultimately being obedient, which is challenging in itself.
Yeah. There's so many times in scripture that I read that like Moses never got to enter the promised land. It didn't happen in his lifetime. And obviously it's because of a sin. But you know, David didn't get to build the temple. And there's so many things that, you know, I think that we as humans want to just speed things along, and it's hard to wait.
It is. It is. But it's the message of Paul, and it's something that definitely applies to us today. And so there's the 2 Thessalonians.
All right.
Knocked out another book just like that. Well, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you guys tuning in and being a part, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
All right. Bye.
See ya.